Now we switch views from pretty much the point of view of what the astronauts have been looking at. From what we have seen, they were looking up, and this is the shot up into that Node 2 Zenith hatchway of the Harmony module. That is Nicole Ayers, NASA astronaut, just on the other side of that APAS hatchway, working with the Axiom Mission 4 crew. You heard them talking about IMV ducting and LiO cartridges. That IMV ducting helps mix the air of the International Space Station environment with the air inside of Dragon. And then also looking to seal up some of those lithium hydroxide cartridges that are used to scrub carbon dioxide from the air in the spacecraft on their journey to the International Space Station. And that journey started yesterday morning, 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern, as they would launch on the SpaceX Dragon, newly named Grace spacecraft, on a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and would chase down the International Space Station earlier this morning at 5:31, nearly 2 hours ago, 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, a little bit more of a day's transit.
Houston and SpaceX Dragon arrival configuration is complete.
Houston copies.
SpaceX copies.
Continuing to target a welcome ceremony or welcome remarks in the near future at 8:35 a.m. Central Time. So a little bit more than an hour from now is Axiom Mission 4 and the International Space Station continuing to work through hatch opening procedures, but getting close, you can start to see a little bit of a window of opportunity that was just on the other side of astronaut Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers there, as they are working on IMV ducting, mixing the air of the station and Dragon, and lithium hydroxide cartridges, stowage and swapping out. So Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers are starting to clear out the hatchway, and we are going to see the first views of Axiom Mission 4. Commander Peggy Whitson, the first one across the APAS hatch, receiving great big hugs from Nicole Ayers and the Expedition 73 crew. Axiom Mission 4, welcome aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Shubhanshu Shukla is the next one to come across, representing ISRO. It is his first space flight for Peggy Whitson, her return to the International Space Station on her fifth flight, second as a member of Axiom Space. Sławosz Wisniewski of ESA, representing the nation of Poland. And their first visit to the International Space Station is next to cross the hatchway. And warm hugs all around. And applause breaking out here inside of Mission Control Houston and International Space Station Flight Control Room. And Tibor Kapu, the fourth and final member of Axiom Mission 4, representing Hunor and the nation of Hungary. Their first visit to the International Space Station as well. Great big hugs and handshakes across all members of Expedition 73 and Axiom Mission 4 is Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers of NASA, along with Johnny Kim, Kirill Peskov, Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zabritsky of Roscosmos, and Takuya Onishi, commander of Expedition 73 and of JAXA, with handshakes and hugs for Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wisniewski, and Tibor Kapu. And with their arrival to the International Space Station, that now makes 288 visitors to the orbiting laboratory. Axiom Mission 4 is now aboard the International Space Station. Commander Peggy Whitson, in her return to the orbiting laboratory, her 5th flight. 3 is a member of NASA, and her 2nd as commander of Axiom, an Axiom Space private astronaut mission, commander of Axiom 2 and here of Axiom 4. Regaling the crew with smiles and stories. To her left, or our left from her viewpoint, to her right, Sławomir Uznański-Wisniewski of ESA, Shubhanshu Shukla to her left of ISRO, and Tibor Kapu on that far right-hand side of our viewpoint. The crew is safely aboard the International Space Station. Welcome again to Axiom Mission 4. And we are continuing to target a formal welcome remark from the crew and being joined by the Expedition 73 team as well. That'll be at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time. And from there, they will receive a safety briefing and begin their nearly approximately 2-week mission aboard the International Space Station, in which they will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. And there they all are, waving back at our coverage here inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room.
Station Houston on 2. Thanks for the wave. Great to see everybody.
Houston Station, we're happy to be here. It's so great to be here finally. It was a long quarantine.
And with the crew now in the space station, we're going to wrap up our portion of the live joint coverage from Hawthorne. It's been an honor to support Axiom Mission 4 thus far, and we wish the crew a successful time on the space station. We're, of course, also looking forward to joining AX4 again when it's time to return home.
Ronnie, from launch to docking, it has been an absolute pleasure sharing this desk with you. What has been years in the making for India, Poland, and Hungary is now well underway. Axiom Space and NASA's joint coverage will continue from here through to the welcome ceremony as Peggy, Shubhanshu, Swavosh, and Tibor start their 2 weeks aboard the orbiting laboratory. Over the course of our crew's time on station, we will be producing mission updates from Axiom Space's own space station development facility in Houston, Texas. So we invite you to follow the progress of AX4 on axiomspace.com and through Axiom Space's social media channels.
So with that, on behalf of SpaceX, Axiom Space, and NASA, thank you all for tuning in to watch. While our stream on X is coming to a close, coverage of the welcome ceremony now continues on NASA Plus, axiom.space/live, and Axiom Space's social channels. With that, we'll turn it back over to you, Joseph. Have a great morning, everyone, and go AX Dragon spacecraft approaching and docking with the International Space Station. Our coverage today will continue through the welcome ceremony that awaits the AX4 crew once they are on board the ISS.
The AX4 mission officially took flight yesterday, June 25th, when the Axiom Space crew lifted off from Kennedy Space Center's historic Pad 39A at 2:31 a.m. Eastern. This is the inaugural flight of the latest Dragon in SpaceX's fleet. Shortly after reaching orbit, Commander Peggy Whitson announced the name of this Dragon, calling it Grace. Our four-person crew for this mission is slated to conduct up to 14 days of efforts aboard the International Space Station. The crew is currently inside Dragon, and they are now positioned just outside the keep-out sphere around the International Space Station, approximately 420 kilometers above Earth.
And so right now, we are awaiting the approach initiation burn that will be the first of several steps that incrementally guide them to the zenith docking port, or the space-facing port of the International Space Station. The Crew 10 Dragon spacecraft will be there to greet the Axiom Mission 4 crew when they arrive as well. NASA Crew 10 astronauts Anne McClain, Nicole Ayers, JAXA, or Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takaya Onishi, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov arrived at the International Space Station on Sunday, March 16th. So with that, let's head over to NASA's Zach Sheshki for a closer look at Dragon's flight to the International Space Station.
Hello, Paul and Ronnie. It's great to be with you, and welcome Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew aboard the International Space Station. I'm joining you from the International Space Station Flight Control Room here at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. This is where mission operations are coordinated 24/7 to ensure the health, safety, and success of the orbiting laboratory, and it's an exciting place to be, especially on a morning like this. Right now, our flight control team behind me, led by Flight Director Allison Bollinger, and the Athena flight team, is actively monitoring all systems aboard the International Space Station as we prepare to welcome Axiom Mission 4. We're just a few moments away from the approach initiation burn to take Dragon and the crew closer to the orbiting laboratory, and the teams on the ground have pulled go already and have tested out and continuing to test out big communications loops, which connects the teams here in Hawthorne, Houston, Dragon Grace, and the International Space Station. For Dragon, they have 16 Draco thrusters aboard to be used to help navigate the spacecraft to its destination, the orbiting laboratory, each providing 90 pounds of force to help it get to its final destination. It's been quite the journey for the crew since launching yesterday morning, starting with the phase burn that happened shortly after launch. Now, it's the first of 5 major burns, that is the phase burn, which happens at the highest point or apogee of Dragon's first orbit and occurred about 46 minutes after launch. It raises the lowest part of the orbit, the perigee, helping Dragon get closer to the space station's path. And then the boost burn would quickly take place. And that is based on what our orbital data shows us as the boost burn, which raises Dragon's orbit until its orbit reaches an altitude about 10 kilometers lower than the space station. And this took place around 8:15 a.m. Central Time yesterday morning. After that, we executed the close burn about 45 minutes later. Next was the close co-elliptic burn, which adjusts Dragon's orbit so it stays about 10 kilometers below the station the whole way around the Earth. Now, co-elliptic just means that both orbits of both the Dragon Grace and the International Space Station are nearly the same shape and the same speed. Several hours later, the transfer burn was then executed, and this is the 4th maneuver in which the transfer burn raises Dragon's highest orbital point to just about 2.5 kilometers below the space station. And then finally, the co-elliptic burn would round everything out, and that would occur just shortly before we came on the air, or earlier this morning, I should say, and that helps Dragon maintain a consistent orbit with the International Space Station. And this keeps And this keeps Dragon in a stable orbit about 2.5 kilometers beneath the space station as it lines up for approach. Now, docking time has been updated as Dragon is moving quickly. Certainly the crew happy to get to the International Space Station, and that docking time currently approximately 5:18 a.m. Central Time. So that all sets things up for the approach initiation burn, and that's where Dragon begins its final climb in that stair step towards the orbiting laboratory. Now, this happens about 2.5 kilometers below and 7 kilometers behind the station. And about 45 minutes before all this happened, and just before we came on the air with you this morning, teams in SpaceX and Hawthorne, as well as NASA here in Houston, started integrated operations, working together to guide Dragon in. During this phase, they activate Dragon's navigation systems and turn on the C2V2, or Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles, a comm system that links Dragon with the space station crew. The approach initiation burn moves Dragon into a spot about a quarter mile, 400 meters directly below the station. It also brings Dragon into a safety zone called the approach ellipsoid. And that is a large invisible oval around the station that measures 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. Now, before entering the approach ellipsoid, Dragon must be on a 24-hour safe trajectory, which means if it lost control due to the thrusters, it wouldn't be able to drift into that area for at least a full day. Now, after approach initiation, which is going to be occurring in about 8.5 minutes from now, the next major milestone will be waypoint 0. And once Dragon arrives at 400 meters below station, it'll be known as waypoint 0, and that's where the first checkpoint will begin for our approach. Dragon Grace can hold here at the 400-meter mark. If all systems check out, it can continue to the approach to waypoint 1, the next gate in its path. And then shortly, the NASA and SpaceX teams will do a no-go poll to move Dragon inside the keep-out sphere, another checkpoint that consists of an imaginary sphere around station with a radius of 200 meters. Flight controllers here on the ground use this to monitor all arriving and departing vehicles, and this is another chance to confirm that all the guidance and navigation and control systems are working correctly on Dragon Grace before moving closer to station. All of this carries a similar requirement on the orbital trajectory of Dragon, and if Dragon were to somehow lose control of its thrusters, and the space station would be safe for 4 orbits or about 6 hours rather than the 24-hour required to enter the approach ellipsoid. So as you can see on your screen, from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1, that's where we move to the next gate, in which waypoint 1 will swing, the Dragon will swing up and over the International Space Station and arrive at an approximate distance of about 220 meters. At this point, it will be on what we call a docking axis. And at this point, it will be on what we call the docking axis, which essentially means it's just directly in front of the docking port for Dragon. And that's where the crew is heading to the space-facing port of station, the Node 2 Zenith port on the Harmony module. And from there, that's where Dragon will be docked for all of our crew missions. And so far, this is where one of 2 docking ports and international docking adapters are located and installed for these new commercial spacecraft flights, as well as other future spacecraft that use the International Docking Standard. As Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew continue to push forward and look to go right to the front step of the International Space Station, the next gate will be waypoint 2. And once Dragon is only 2 meters away at waypoint 2, the spacecraft focuses on aligning and fine-tuning its docking system with that international docking adapter on the International Space Station. From that point, we may hear out the call-out CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands-Off Point, and that happens a little less than 30 seconds or so before docking. At this point, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon. And then from there, it's the moment we've all been waiting for the Axiom Mission 4 team and the crew aboard the International Space Station, and that'll be the moment of contact, where the crew arrives to the space station and Dragon and the station make contact with giving us that final call and soft capture. And again, we are tracking for a approximate docking time of 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern Time. Once soft capture is made, the soft capture ring that connects the two will then retract until the sensors indicate it's time for the 12 hooks to drive in place to give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to its new home and the space station. The Expedition 73 crew, namely Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, aboard the International Space Station, got up earlier this morning, and they have already begun procedures to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team, and they will manually pressurize the vestibule or area between the Dragon hatch and the station hatch. And meanwhile, the umbilicals that provide the power and communications and data connections from there are being sure to be put in place. And then it's time for leak checks and hatch opening, which are currently lined up to come about 2 hours following the docking. And again, that docking time, 5:18 a.m. Central. When Dragon docks there, it'll be 5 spacecraft docked to the station with 11 crew members making its way on board the orbital outpost, and that'll bring the total number of visitors to the International Space Station to 288 since 1998. Once aboard the orbiting laboratory, the Axiom Mission 4 crew will participate in about 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, and more than 24 of those experiments supported by the ISS National Laboratory. And there's a live look at the teams here on the ground. On the left-hand side, that is Mission Control in SpaceX, Hawthorne, California, following along with Dragon's progress, I should say. And on the right-hand side, it looks to be Axiom Space here in Houston, just down the road from Johnson Space Center, NASA's Johnson Space Center, where we are located. And the International Space Station Flight Control Room, all 3 teams working together in integrated operations. That began just before we went live for today's broadcast. We're all 3 monitoring the progress of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. And you've been hearing communications on what is the Big Loop, which is that single line of comms that allow for the Dragon spacecraft and Grace to communicate with the International Space Station, but also for the teams on the ground here in Houston and in California and Hawthorne, all to communicate together. So everybody on the same page as the spacecraft continues its push towards the orbiting lab. We are about 26 minutes away, a little bit north of that, until we reach waypoint 1 for Dragon Grace. As you can see, some of that telemetry and data populating the screens inside of the spacecraft that the team on board are carefully monitoring. And this is the view from the Dragon spacecraft looking up at the International Space Station, as these two now making their way into the southernmost regions of the Pacific Ocean, having just passed underneath the south and then the southeast of Australia. They will continue into an orbital nighttime period until they reach roughly about the east coast of North America, and then you'll get some of those great views of the sunlight radiating over top of both of the craft. So far, everything performing nominally for the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its push towards the International Space Station, and what's been quite the journey for them. You heard earlier that this, since launch all the way up to the anticipated docking time, will be about a 28-hour process, 28, 29 hours or so. So a lot has happened in a short amount of time as the teams in Hawthorne, California on the left and the teams on the right-hand side in Axiom Space working together with those here in Houston. And those teams right now communicating with each other on those internal communications loops that we monitor and follow along with as they Now prepare the teams for waypoint 1, about 24 minutes from now. The go no go for that will be in about 15 minutes or so. And we'll keep an ear out for those comms as, again, Dragon starting to slow down its approach towards the International Space Station, a very methodical journey that all started shortly after launch, what was yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That saw the Axiom mission 4 team reach orbit and begin its journey to track down the International Space Station, the 4th private astronaut mission, and the first since January of 2024, when Axiom mission 3 would join the expedition aboard the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station, the crews, they were up and got right into preparing for Dragon's arrival. NASA's Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who you've heard at times on the big communications loop talking to all parties. They are in the station's cupola using specialized software to track Dragon's approach and making sure it stays in the expected zones with that orbital nighttime currently enveloping the station and the Dragon spacecraft. They're keeping a close eye, and of course from the space station perspective, and we'll see it as we receive video communication, that strobing effect, that strobe light on the front, and that forward nose cone of the SpaceX Dragon to help illuminate its path and help keep track. Earlier, we also received that as the Dragon spacecraft makes its way towards waypoint 1, about 22 minutes from now, that the teams on the ground were looking to bypass this milestone, but will again do a go, no go poll, make sure everything looks exactly as it should before allowing that bypass of the spacecraft, and then its maneuver up and over top of the International Space Station, and then proceeding onto waypoint 2. And a great graphic of the International Space Station, and just below it, the Dragon spacecraft is, again, they are making their journey across the Pacific Ocean, traveling over 26,000 kilometers an hour and 420 plus kilometers above the Earth's surface. We've been talking about that methodical approach for the Dragon spacecraft that started immediately, or 45 minutes or so immediately after launch yesterday morning, in which they would execute a series of burns from the phase burn to the boost burn, co-elliptic or close burn, transfer, and co-elliptic burn. Those 5 burns allow for the stair-stepping of Dragon to climb up in altitude, but also to close the gap, the distance between the International Space Station and the spacecraft itself. And that is what's led us up to this morning. The approach initiation burn started just shortly after the start of this broadcast, in which Dragon, in integrated operations with SpaceX and NASA working together with Axiom Space, all monitoring closely as Dragon Grace continues its way towards the orbiting lab, and looking to turn a crew, the Expedition 73 crew of 7, into a total of 11, a full house above the orbiting lab. Now inside 20 minutes to the waypoint 1 arrival. And about 10 minutes or so, the teams here inside Houston, as well as and SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, will continue to monitor and do the go, no go for waypoint 1. And if everything is on track, they'll continue to proceed through waypoint 1 onto waypoint 2. And waypoint 2 has them right on the doorstep of the International Space Station, about 20 meters out when they arrive to that waypoint, a little more than 65 feet away. If you are just joining us, we are continuing to follow along the progress of Axiom Mission 4 and the 4 astronauts aboard, Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, and mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu, the 4th private astronaut mission and the first since January 2024 to make its way towards the International Space Station, in which they will spend approximately 2 weeks doing research investigations and outreach activities, expanding commercial space. We are tracking a docking time of approximately 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. The next key milestone that we are keeping an eye on is the arrival of the spacecraft to waypoint 1. And to gain perspective, waypoint 1 will be about 220 meters away between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And that's the second checkpoint. They have already reached waypoint 0 to begin this process. Waypoint 0, waypoint 1, and then on to waypoint 2, which we mentioned is about 20 meters away. Great views there from the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft, that strobe light illuminating its path, as well as the port and starboard side lights. The red and green that you see on your screen is both the International Space Station and Dragon Grace in an orbital nighttime period. They're actually crossing over the Pacific Ocean, about to cross over the equator, and then eventually make its way over the west coast of North America. We'll start to see the spacecraft and the International Space Station once again become illuminated with an orbital sunrise. In a few more moments, that'll occur as they continue their journey over the Pacific Ocean. And for the Dragon spacecraft, approaching waypoint 1, now about 15 minutes from that point. And we'll continue to bring those great views as you see that slow and steady progress of the Dragon vehicle as it continues to track down the orbiting laboratory. And on your screen, you see the speed and altitude, where it is in over the Earth in current relation. But on that far right-hand side, that's the thruster firings. And you just see those illuminate every so often as Dragon continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And this mission since launch approaching now 1 day, 3 hours or 3.5 hours of time. That's the time you see in the middle there, the T plus. 1 day, 3 hours, 28 minutes and 40 plus seconds. As the crew aboard, anxious and ready to join the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. And as we take a look at those crew members and introduce them to you, that'll welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. They're led by Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, who just recently celebrated about 2 weeks ago his 200 days in space. Anne McLean, NASA flight engineer, will be there as well. Her and Nicole Ayers, the two NASA astronauts monitoring Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. For McLean, celebrating 300 days in space last week. And for Nicole Ayers, this past Monday, celebrated 100 days in microgravity. They're also joined by NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, flight engineer, and Roscosmos cosmonauts Kirill Peskov. For Peskov, he would also celebrate 100 days this past Monday as a part of the Crew at 10 team. And then Roscosmos cosmonauts Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky also joining the cadre of 7 astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier this is the 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station, and the first since January of 2024, since Axiom Mission 3. From the Axiom Mission 1 now through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 111 different nations, and showcasing how these private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we talked about this crew, in approximately their 2 weeks on board the orbiting laboratory, will participate in around 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, with more than 24 of those experiments sponsored by the ISS National Lab. In about 2 minutes, we'll monitor the loops and keep an ear out for the go, no-go poll on the ground for teams that'll be monitoring Dragon's approach to waypoint 1. And that waypoint will be reached in a little less than a dozen minutes, 12 minutes from now. This is Mission Control Houston, as we are continuing to monitor the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4, the private astronaut mission, as it continues its approach to the International Space Station. They have moved past waypoint 0 and are now on its way to waypoint 1, the second of 3 checkpoints or 3 gates for this journey for the spacecraft to the orbiting laboratory. We just received update that the new anticipated docking time, approximately 5:30 a.m. Central Time, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station teams here on the ground, both in Hawthorne, California for SpaceX, and inside of NASA's Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, continuing to work together in communication and relay those updated data and projections and trajectory and all the information needed. So again, that docking time has been updated to now approximately 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. And the flight control teams here in Houston and listening in on the loops on overall communications have just pulled go for Dragon's approach to waypoint 1. And they will reach that milestone waypoint 1 in about 9 minutes from now. This waypoint will have the spacecraft 220 meters away from the International Space Station, a little more than 656 feet. And once it reaches that docking access, an additional go-no-go pole will be created, in which the teams will then pull for the arrival of the spacecraft to waypoint 2. And given the go there, Dragon Grace will move to within 20 meters and little more than 65 feet from the orbiting laboratory. And earlier we also had communications that if everything goes to plan and Dragon continues to remain on its trajectory, that they would bypass waypoint 1 and go straight from 0 to waypoint 2. But once it arrives to waypoint 1, this will be the point in the spacecraft's journey in which we will be on what we call the docking axis, which will essentially mean that it is directly in front of the docking port that it'll connect itself to. The crew are right now heading to the space-facing port on the International Space Station, node to zenith of the Harmony module. That zenith meaning it is the side of the space station facing space. So its journey brings it from underneath the International Space Station, Dragon Grace, to swinging up and over top of it, and then arriving at that docking access en route to waypoint 2. We'll continue to bring views of the International Space Station and Dragon Grace spacecraft as we receive them, as the two continuing their chase to connect up as they're now making their way towards the western coast of North America in an orbital nighttime configuration. And we've seen views of the Dragon spacecraft in that orbital nighttime with the strobe lights shining bright. Once it gets closer, it'll actually illuminate the International Space Station and allow for greater views of the docking port itself that it'll connect to. And again, that node 2 is zenith port of the Harmony module of the space station. And that anticipated docking time that has now recently been updated to 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. Teams on the ground have pulled go for Dragon's approach to waypoint 1. And that arrival to that checkpoint will be a little more than 5 minutes from now. The crew inside Dragon Grace Axiom Mission 4. They are in their launch and entry suits and ready to continue their journey towards the International Space Station. And there you see it, the view from the orbiting laboratory, looking at Dragon Grace. As you see that strobe light we were just mentioning, as it gets closer, will illuminate the side of the orbiting laboratory, as well as the port and starboard lights, the red and green. Crew in their launch and entry suits, providing that extra layer of protection and pressure, and that happens, are in them during these dynamic phases of flight. Now inside 5 minutes from waypoint 1. When Dragon docks to the International Space Station. There will be 5 spacecraft connected to the orbital outpost, and we'll bring the crew up to 11 crew members, and the overall total of the International Space Station to 288 visitors since 1998. It will join the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that brought up Crew 10 back in March. They will also join with the Soyuz MS-27, a spacecraft that brought NASA astronaut Johnny Kim to the International Space Station in early April. And then 2 cargo craft, Progress cargo craft from Roscosmos also aboard the station, and then eventually the Dragon Grace spacecraft, as we get now views inside of Dragon Grace and looking over the shoulders of Commander Peggy Whitson and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO. And you see them adjusting their monitors as the approach continues on for Dragon. And then a great view in the middle of the screen there of the path Dragon is taking. Last time we saw inside, it was more towards the left-hand side of the screen, in which Dragon now flying up and over top of the International Space Station. And now we get great views from Dragon Grace, and there's the strobe light. You can see it ever so faintly illuminating the International Space Station as it continues.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is transmitting docking camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in Dragon Docking Monitor. Also, we have a new docking time of 10:30.
Copies. We are seeing data on the Dragon Docking Monitor, and we copy 10:30 for the new docking time.
Houston copies.
Great communications there on the Big Loop between the teams in Houston and SpaceX, talking to Dragon Grace and the confirmations of the updated docking time. You heard the words 10:30. That's 10:30 Zulu, which Central Time is 5:30, as we had mentioned, 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. As we return to that exciting view from Dragon looking up at the International Space Station, you can ever so faintly see the solar arrays coming into view, and that strobe light illuminating the radiators, which are right along that central portion and angling upward. The International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft now approaching the west coast of North America, right around the Seattle area, that border between the United States and Canada, as we are approaching 1 minute away from waypoint 1, the second checkpoint and second series of waypoints for the spacecraft to reach to. The teams have already pulled go, but we will listen for the call outs for that waypoint 1 arrival.
Dragon SpaceX on the Big Loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue approach to waypoint 2. As a reminder, manual impulsive retreat recovery is not permitted.
And Dragon copies all.
And there you heard communications on the Big Loop about that soft capture ring, and that is the initial contact that will occur between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, a soft capture, with that soft capture ring then retracting and the 12 hooks that will drive and connect and form a hard mate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. From there, power communications will then be connected up, and NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers will make her way into the pressurized mating adapter and get ready for hatch opening procedures, which will require bringing the vestibule, the space between the two hatches, between the International Space Station and Dragon Grace, together. And there we see the orbital sunrise making its way over top of the International Space Station as they continue their pursuit of each other, now angling over at North America. And there in the center screen, if you look at the topmost, the Dragon now perfectly aligned over top of the International Space Station, now looking down at that Node 2 Zenith port, and a great view just off the bottom portion there. That is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that it'll be just alongside of. So Dragon has reached waypoint 0, and on initial comms earlier that the teams on the ground, once reaching waypoint 1, have been allowed to bypass that waypoint and now move on to waypoint 2, which will be in about 9 minutes from now, and targeting docking in about 14.5 minutes from there. Go, no-go polls for docking in about 7 minutes as the teams on the ground continuing to monitor Dragon's progress. And once they arrive to waypoint 2, there will be a pause, make sure everything is lined up just perfectly before that final approach and docking. This is Mission Control Houston as Dragon Grace and the spacecraft carrying Axiom Mission 4 and their 4 astronauts continuing their approach to the International Space Station. They have just made their way past waypoint 1, which had them at 220 meters away from the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. And now on the path to reach waypoint 2, teams on the ground have concurred or agreed that they will take a brief pause at waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away, to make sure everything is aligned precisely. And there you see the view from Dragon and that newly illuminated International Space Station as the 2 craft navigating its way over North America, coming into an orbital sunrise and daytime period.
Station on the big loop. Dragon attitude is still as expected, and station is ready for docking.
Houston copies. At waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking, then automatically resume approach.
Station copies.
Commentator Rob.
You just heard great communications on the big loop from Station and Dragon, as well as the teams in Houston and in Hawthorne for SpaceX and NASA, as the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its approach to the International Space Station, carrying Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA,
Dragon
and
SpaceX
Tibor.
soft capture ring extension complete. Dragon will continue through waypoint 2 without a hold.
Second copy. No hold at waypoint 2 and good rating extension.
Great communications there. They were anticipating a brief hold to make sure everything aligns, but Dragon Grace continuing on what has been so far so good. A great rendezvous with the International Space Station. They will proceed to continue past waypoint 2. And you also heard in the communications with NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, the station ready for docking. And a great view of the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft making its glacial approach to the International Space Station, and the view from the space station looking up as it approaches the space-facing or node 2 zenith port of the Harmony module. We are about 4 minutes away from the waypoint 2 arrival, which again they are expecting to move right past through without a hold. That is at the 20-meter mark, and proceed right on into docking, a soft capture, and then soft capture ring retraction and hooks to drive. And that capture about
Dragon
8 minutes
SpaceX
and 47.
on the big loop, ground is go for approach 2, and approach is now allowed. Reminder, ensure that visors are closed prior to Dragon's departure from the waypoint. Once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies, and we have visors down, and we are go for docking as well. And copy on the approach. Inside 2, stop.
SpaceX copies, visors down, SpaceX crew is go for docking.
All great communications there as the communications from the ground up to the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, as visors are down on the 4 astronauts inside as they continue their approach to the International Space Station, now nearly 7 minutes away from that initial contact. Dragon and the International Space Station now making its way over the northernmost territories of North America and Canada, and heading towards the Atlantic Ocean, as we are now 7.5 minutes away from the approximate docking time, as Dragon will move smoothly past waypoint 2, about 20 meters away. And continuing its fine-tuning and approach, you see little plumes coming off the spacecraft. Again, those are those thruster firings continuing to inch and adjust the spacecraft towards the orbiting laboratory. Dragon continuing to get bigger and bigger from the viewpoint of the International Space Station, as waypoint 2 about 90 seconds away, and there it'll be just a mere 20 meters away. And there the spacecraft will focus on aligning its docking system with the docking adapter, and then fly in to make the initial contact and give us what we will call that soft capture, or the soft capture ring will retract. And then the hooks will drive to form the hard mate. And that capture, or that initial contact, coming in about 6 minutes from now.
Yes, they have it. I can press them. They switched up.
Approaching 30 seconds away from waypoint 2 arrival, in which the Dragon spacecraft will be about 20 meters away, just called out 30 meters, so continuing its close in to the International Space Station. Dragon Grace now 25 meters away. Dragon has now reached waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the International Space Station, and will continue its approach to the International Space Station. And there you can see a great view of that zenith port, that space-facing port on the International Space Station's Harmony module. As the Dragon spacecraft right now sitting at waypoint 2, just 20 meters away.
And at station per step 4 in block Bravo. Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 and 1.102.
Station copies. Monitoring per steps 5 and 6.
And there you heard it. The final steps relayed up to the crew for final approach and docking have been given as we continue to see Dragon Grace spacecraft close the gap between them and the International Space Station. Now, just before the spacecraft reaches the international docking adapter for that soft capture, you'll hear the call out CHOP, or crew hands off point, which Dragon will continue its journey and make that initial connection, that soft capture, in those final few moments.
Dragon, 10 meters.
10 meters.
Inside 10 meters, a little less now than 30 feet away, is all that separates Dragon Grace from the International Space Station.
Five meters.
5 meters.
meters, chop.
Houston Station, 2 meters, chop.
We have chop.
1 meter.
1 meter. Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
Ready, copy.
Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have arrived to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time over the North Atlantic as the two orbiting around the Earth, connecting with the soft capture ring, and now we'll begin the ring retraction to bring the two vehicles closer together, and then the 12 hooks, the two sets of 6, will drive to form a hard nut. And there you heard there, the soft capture ring is retracting, and then we'll do so until sensors are indicating it's time for those hooks to drive in place and give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to station. And again, Axiom Mission 4 and its commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, and mission specialist Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu of ESA and HUNOR have arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting over the North Atlantic. The soft capture ring, that initial contact between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, continuing to retract, and we'll await for the calls that the sensors read that it will be time for those 12 hooks on the Dragon to then begin driving and connecting itself to form a hard mate to the International Space Station.
Ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
This is Mission Control Houston, as you are seeing a live view of the recently connected Dragon Gray spacecraft with the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts and Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu arrive to the International Space Station. Soft capture and contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting above the North Atlantic. And right now, the two mated with that soft capture, the soft capture ring retracting to pull the spacecraft closer to the International Space Station. And once given the go, the ring or the hooks around the Dragon nose cone will drive and connect to form a hard mate. Teams on the ground in both Houston.
Station Houston on the big loop. MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And the great call there, that's the next step in this docking procedure, is the driving of the hooks, the 12 hooks surrounding the nose cone or the nose of the Dragon spacecraft. And we'll monitor those. They'll drive in 2 sets of 6. The first set of 6 right now, they're